Thank you very much also for inviting me, for that wonderful introduction, and for joining here and also online. Let me start with a quote. This is from what I think is a fantastic book by Kathleen Fitzpatrick on how universities can become more generous, in which she charges us all with thinking constructively rather than competitively. Think about building new ideas, listening over speaking, and also community over individualism, collaboration over competition. And this is really close to my heart and also close to the research agenda on how evaluation interacts with knowledge production in universities and other knowledge institutions. I'm a social scientist, psychologist by training, and I specialize in this social scientific research on research evaluation. Well, that this is close to my heart, I want to illustrate with a story. So a couple of years ago, I received a very disturbing email by an Italian marine biologist called Nando Buero, whom I got to know after that quite well. And he wrote me that he was quite frustrated because he was unable to get his findings published in the key journals in his field. And he studies the occurrence of swarms of jellyfish. More specifically, he's interested in why we see very high numbers of bloom periods in the recent years. Not exactly a trivial finding, also because rising numbers of jellyfish blooms are an important indication that the ecologies of the seas are disturbed. So he got in touch with me, not to tell me that, but he read an article I wrote with a colleague on, we call that thinking with indicators, on the effects of working with indicators in the life sciences. And that article confirmed his own belief that science is not being properly evaluated today. And he mentioned in that email also the strict norms in his field, how they are translated into the national science system in Italy. And he wrote that as an established researcher, he often collaborates on policy reports. He does a lot of citizen science, but these types of activities are very hard to put up for evaluation in the Italian system. It doesn't revolve around publishing in high impact international peer-reviewed journals with a high impact factor. So he went on to say, but I want to make clear that this output is much more valuable than anything I have published in my career to date. However, the current evaluation mechanisms do not assess its true value. I've written manuals for students, given scientific advice to policymakers, but this counts for nothing in the academic world. I also don't add my name unnecessarily to articles written by colleagues, so my publication numbers are decreasing. According to the current evaluation criteria, I am lazier now than I was in the past. Now, I do this in exclamation marks, but he's much, much more provocative when you speak with him. So in my own work, as I said, I specialize in social studies of research evaluation. So this type of interaction for me is also source material, and it's actually one of the triggers for that ERC project that Kirsten just mentioned. I'm very interested to see how all this evaluating and rating and ranking of universities and research groups came about. I also want to know how it affects the daily work of researchers and the science system at large. So that's my academic agenda, but it's also explicitly an interventionist agenda. We do outreach activities. We also write, indeed, things like the Leiden Manifesto. So here you see on the top left a comment by Philip Ball. He's a science writer and editor of Nature, in which he describes quite succinctly, I think, how science has changed over the past century toward more team science, big science, and also toward fulfilling its social contract by confronting issues of global reach and, as he calls it, existential urgency. And we are living one of those right now. Epidemics, climate breakdown, 2 of those we're living right now. Here, another slide. Ball and many other commentators signal important changes to what we sociologically refer to as the institutions that underpin research. So that includes communication, but also evaluation. Communication papers, can monographs still contain the research results of today? But not only communication, also evaluation systems at large. So do systems of credit of today still work to acknowledge the diversifications of roles in research, or are they actually failing? And especially the last, 3 to 8 years, we clearly see that concern has intensified over a couple of elements. So the misapplication of metrics, that contributes to enormous pressures on researchers. Also deepens problems with research integrity, reproducibility. We also see a reduction of the diversity of research missions and purposes that leads institutions and also researchers to adopt similar strategic priorities or to focus on low risk and potentially incremental work. And there are also issues with systemic bias against those who do not meet or choose not to prioritize narrow criteria and indicators of quality and impact. And of course also a diversion of attention in policy and management to think and things in ways that can be measured at the expense of maybe less tangible or less quantifiable qualities. Now, interestingly, and also quite worrisome, I think, is that what we currently see happening all too often is that we resort to these easy-to-use indicators and metrics to assess science and scientists on the basis of availability of data about performance. And what we're not doing is making it a bit harder on ourselves, but to look for where the answers are more likely to be found. And that's called the streetlight effect of indicators. So this is a very schematic representation. I'm not an artist. I come from a family of artists, but this is of course not really... This is just PowerPoint. This is a schematic representation of the severity of the issue. So what you see here in the largest circle is a representation of all the potential problems we have in the world. And within that space in blue, we have the space of research, those problems that can potentially be addressed by doing research. And within that space, in yellow, is the smaller space of research that we then, in fact, can illuminate well with the current set of indicators we currently use to assess research and researchers. Now, the streetlight effect is mistaking the light with the actual problems. And it's really hard to defend, I think, that what happens in the gray zone is not relevant. But it's really important to realize that the questions dealt by research under the streetlight is better rewarded and often at the expense of other forms of research and other activities and other forms of collaboration. I also should be clear, I'm not going to give you the final answer or solution to this issue. That's going to take a lot of work, but carving out what the problem is the beginning, I think. So all this could be seen as maybe a purely technical issue, but it's not. It's also really political. It's also not random what's left out. There's politics of inclusion, there's politics of exclusion. And there's also potential marginalization on a couple of fronts. So you can think of topics that fall outside of the mainstream, transdisciplinary work, parts of the work done by social sciences and humanities that are not covered well enough in citation databases. Think also of non-English publications. Don't count in the same way either. But also whole sectors are less visible under this streetlight, including low-tech research, agricultural research, research done by and with the creative industry. And these are just a few examples. Now, this, I think, is the move that we should try to facilitate when we assess. I think it's still relevant to assess and to talk about how things are going in a field, in a department, and in individual careers, but maybe not in the reductive way that we're doing this right now. So we should use research, evaluation, and indicators to our advantage and let them help us also to open up and also broaden out what can be researched. On the slide, some initiatives I've been involved in myself, but there's much more out there, and we can talk about those as well. Very briefly, this is all collaboration with either local colleagues or international colleagues to work toward more responsible forms of research evaluation, and also, in the end, more open and more inclusive research cultures. So on the top left, you see an initiative that's part of a national level initiative in Dutch universities and Dutch funders to move toward better recognition and reward systems. Very complex process, as you can imagine. Each university has a steering group to do this local transformation work, and I'm co-chairing that one in Leiden. On the right, you see the UNESCO recommendation on open science that will be published this fall, that Kirsten also mentioned. But I would now like to focus on the initiative in the middle, the Leiden Manifesto. So as Kirsten said, this was published in 2015. At that time, the community of scientometricians and research evaluation experts were discussing for a number of years now how to deal with what they saw as misuse of metrics in daily practice. And that was also happening at conferences. So we had sessions on how can we deal with this situation. This was of course not the point of working with metrics at all. Simplistic indicators instead of more sophisticated metrics started to become dominant in research evaluation practices. Can we do something? Can we step up and take responsibility also for maybe offering guidance on how to use or how to not use bibliometrics in research evaluation? So the Leiden Manifesto is a not new knowledge, but it's a distillation of the best practice in metrics-based research assessment. So I would encourage you to read it. This is a bit boring slide, but I will take you through the 10 principles very briefly. The first one, quantitative evaluation should support qualitative expert assessment. The metrics can challenge bias, can challenge bias tendencies in peer review and facilitate also deliberation, but they should be really used to strengthen peer review and not replace peer review. The second one is measure performance against the research missions of the institution, group or researcher. When you have a new assignment to do transdisciplinary work in an environment, in a disciplinary environment that has other types of criteria, that might be a really big challenge. But this is a really important first step to think about the link between the missions and the criteria in assessments. Program goals should also be stated at the start, and the indicators used should really clearly relate to those. The third is protect excellence in locally relevant research. We can also discuss whether or not we should continue to use the word excellence, which is also very problematic in itself, but that was a bit too difficult to pull off in a short comment. So this principle is about the fact that in many parts of the world, research excellence is equated with English language publication. And the impact factor is also calculated for journals indexed in the US-based and still mostly English language Web of Science. And those are biases that are really problematic, especially for traditions where other languages are used in scholarly publishing. It's also problematic for parts of the social sciences and humanities, which have that also regional and national engagement. Now, the fourth is keep data collection and analytical processes open, transparent, and simple. So the construction of the databases required for evaluation should follow clearly stated rules, and commercial entrants should also be held to the same standards. So we should not accept a black box evaluation machine. And if you think about it, it usually is partly, if not fully, black boxed. The fifth principle is allow those evaluated to verify data and analysis. All researchers should be able to check that their outputs have been correctly identified, and everyone directing and managing evaluation processes should also assure data accuracy. This takes time and that takes money, and that complicated process should also be budgeted for by universities. The sixth is account for variation by field in publication and citation practices. One of the issues with the H-index is that it doesn't. So a best practice is also to use a suite of indicators, both qualitative and quantitative, and allow fields to choose for them among themselves. Base assessment of individual researchers on a qualitative judgment of their portfolio. The recent, I think, good practice emerging when it comes to individual level assessment is to work with what's called a narrative CV, in which researchers are invited to describe their research agenda in relation to the outcomes and outputs, which can also include hard evidence. But here again is that link between the mission and the outcomes and outputs. Avoid misplaced concreteness and false precision. There's conceptual ambiguity. There's also uncertainty when it comes to indicators. They require strong assumptions. Not all of them are universally accepted. So it doesn't really make any sense to distinguish between journals on the basis of really small impact factor differences, 3 decimals behind the comma. The 9 and 10 are also really important. So recognize the systemic effects of assessment and indicators. This means that indicators and incentives also change the system once they are circulating. And that means that we should anticipate those effects and also again use this suite of indicators to try to avoid, for instance, gaming and also goal displacement, in which the measurement becomes the goal. And the final one is scrutinize indicators regularly and update them. That is because of that performative effect of these indicators, and also because research missions, research goals change, goals of the assessment change. So the system co-evolves, so that also means that once useful metrics become totally inadequate, and also that new ones emerge. So these systems should be reviewed and also perhaps modified. So what does responsible research evaluation look like for transdisciplinary research? Dispersed activities, iterative often, focusing on real-world issues, in collaboration often with non-academic partners and stakeholders. Taking into account a couple of these principles that we just saw, including measure performance against the research missions of an institution, a group, or a researcher, and also to protect excellence in locally relevant research. Now, fundamentally, so this is the larger idea. A best practice is a portfolio approach. That is the basis for all responsible research assessment. It is also quite complicated to design because it means that you have to really work on what this looks like for the local context. And you get into discussions about standardization and about comparability and about fairness and about leadership in the end, because it requires a very different form of leadership to have discussions about what is good research when you cannot outsource this to metrics or university rankings, or not completely. So not a one-size-fits-all, but a suite of criteria that may include outcome measurements, evaluations of engagement across communities, assessments of structure, assessments of process. So that also includes open research practices, for instance, but also looking at the capabilities of a certain environment, meaning what is the infrastructure there? What does the lab look like? Is there a lab? So that you don't compare apples and oranges. Some labs, I'm now speaking only of labs for the sake of brevity, have a lot of funding and can do a lot of work with dozens of people, and other labs can't. So these types of things are structural and should also be taken into account. And then the tricky part also for developing indicators and for disciplines like mine is move toward more advanced and also next generation criteria and metrics, including ones that look at open research, responsible research and innovation, and public engagement. Now I'd like to give you one brief example of a building block, a relatively modest building block. An example of a quantitative building block that could be considered as one of the approaches in broader portfolio, in a broader portfolio of criteria for evaluating transdisciplinary research. But again, this is just an example, and I've been stressing taking into account the local context. So yeah, we should probably talk about that. Now, as we all know, research activity is not limited to publishing, and there are also other forms of scholarly communication than publishing in journal articles. So this means that we can open up what we want to include when we talk about quality when it comes to what do we look at. We can look at other forms of scholarly communication, but we can also broaden out the type of activities that we look at. Here's also a risk, a challenge that we, I think, all don't want this huge metric machinery that starts to look at everything simultaneously and becomes this big brother. So it's really important to stress this peer review basis in which this should all be grounded. So to expand the picture, we need to consider other forms of output, other signals of activity. And in addition to that, the more formal ways to indicate research activity, such as publications, they also usually take some time to accrue and also become visible. And that creates also a real issue when it comes to timely assessments. Now, fortunately, we can also find many early signals of research activity online. What we could, for instance, start to zoom in on are research projects and also research institutes. They create websites, they maintain them, they publish online reports, they publish blog posts, or maintain online presences on social media. And all these activities that are visible online may, in turn, attract attention from other entities and actors online. So you could call that digital responses. And what could that look like concretely? Now, so if we think about the case that another website includes a link to the website of a research project, or that social media users follow the account of a research project, and interact with the content shared. And we can then capture these traces of online attention with computational methods. So we can use, for instance, search engines to find mentions of a very specific term or a very specific title. Or we could use services to collect what is known as backlinks. So that is all the links that refer to a given web address. And we can also collect data on activities on Twitter at a very large scale. And what that does is that it covers the different affordances of a platform like Twitter, such as who follows a certain account or how much attention do certain posts receive. Now again here, of course, when you harvest that kind of information and these traces, the work isn't done. It still requires a lot of cleaning, very labor-intensive work, contextualizing the data. But ultimately, I guess the goal here is... oh, did I not put that up yet? I'm just talking without the slide. I'm sorry. I hope I hope people were able to follow. Ultimately, I think the goal is to reveal linkages between research-related entities, such as in this example projects or institutes, and other actors, societal actors, as they unfold and in an online environment. So, for example, we could ask, how does your university, how do the large EU Horizon 2020 projects resonate in and also with society, and who collaborates with you, who else interacts with the project outcomes. My colleagues, this is a recent case study developed by Jonathan Dudek and Rodrigo Costas and a colleague from outside of our institution, and they looked at 121 research projects, all from this Horizon 2020 funded Science with and for Society program. And each of these projects had a website, so it was possible to identify other websites that link to those project websites. And in the network you see here, we can see a selection of those websites, and the links between them are based on mutual links to a project website. So they took this idea from scientometric methods like bibliographic coupling and adapted this for this local purpose. So in other words, when two websites are connected in the network, they both link to the same research project website. And what that exploratory work shows is two things. So it's possible to characterize the digital response received by research projects by looking, for instance, at the topical clusters that emerge here. So you see here a blue cluster at the top that relates to citizen science. And this indicates a particular connectedness with that topic. And what we can also spot is that certain actors are specifically visible. So we see a museum in purple. I don't know if the colors come through. No, they should be circled. Let me see if I can... Yeah. This is better. So we see a museum. We see universities in green, or funding organizations in dark blue. Now this is work that they are currently developing, but I think it shows the potential for investigating traces of societal attention for activities around research as they happen online. I come to the conclusion of the talk. So I said that that was a really modest example of a quantitative building block that could be considered in the context of evaluating broader activities that might also be relevant for transdisciplinary work. And again, I think it's crucial to remember that the primacy in research evaluation shouldn't be on these fancy computational methods, but should lie really with the peers. And also, that doesn't mean that they are really always very knowledgeable about new developments in how to do research evaluation. Obviously, bibliometrics can be very reductive. Not everyone has the vocabulary yet to apply less quantified methods. So this is the bibliometric creep in the middle. What we often see in formal assessments is that evaluators creep into reductive metrics uses, often also because they don't know how to do it differently or haven't been trained to do this differently. And there's not yet like a quick fix for a new alternative. This is something that we together have to work on and develop. Often people don't realize that there are also ways in which quantitative information can be used in more interesting ways. And as I said, also evaluators need to be trained and also afford themselves to be trained and are okay with that to be trained, even if they're very established, to use this information with care and also more creatively. So the best practice is to enable assessment on multiple criteria, apply interesting metrics where possible, and for instance about this societal connectedness. And I think all of that is essential for opening up what can be discussed in evaluations, including engagement with societal actors, including open research or leadership, equality and diversity, and transdisciplinary activities. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to the rest of the day and the symposium. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much at this point. I have several questions which pops up in my head, but do anybody here have questions? Now would be the time. Rick. Wait. Stop.
I can hear you, yes. I don't know if it matters for the recording, though.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the very enlightening talk. Finally, I know one of the authors of the Leiden Manifest, or at least I see in the same room. One question. I'm frequently discussing this with peers and friends of mine. How do we teach the public if we open up more, and we should open up more to science? How do we teach the public to distinguish between real science and fake news, fake science, especially considering recent trends like, I don't know, COVID pandemic and so on, things like that, where people seem to pick those pieces of science they think are science and read online that they like, not those that have been peer-reviewed or evaluated.
Yeah, that's a really big challenge, yes. And it's
personal thoughts on this.
Very, very familiar challenge. Yeah. I'm thinking about a recent interaction last year, an anecdote. Maybe I'll start with that and gather my thoughts. So what we had in the Netherlands was a media figure that was starting to talk about aerosols in public debates, and he wanted to be on one of the major news television shows to tell his story, but he was completely ignored. So he mobilized a lot of, he mobilized many critical audience members, and in the end he was invited to this TV show, and the other person that he was discussing with was one of the scientists from the outbreak management team that influence the direction of the government measures. And that person had a very condescending attitude towards the media figure. And on Twitter I noticed that some of my colleagues were agreeing with the scientist and saying, okay, but this media figure should really, if he wants to make a claim about what works or not, he should publish about this, and it should go through peer review. And then I thought that's really interesting. So I think that is a really problematic thing to say. But I also think that it's important to go through peer review and do quality control properly. I'm not sure if this is the best answer to the response, or the best response to this really crucial input that he gave, that represented ideas from a larger audience, in the way that he did. So I think part of the responsibilities of academics is to also be able to have a discussion in a public forum without referring to, let's get this published in a peer-reviewed journal. And that means, I think, that we need to be trained and also equipped to have that discussion. And that's where I see a link with the way we organize quality control and have discussions with leadership. And if it can be included in the way, maybe not for everyone, but in disciplines like that, with huge societal ramifications, if we can talk about that also when we hire someone or promote someone, can you engage? Can you communicate about your research in other ways than also in peer-reviewed journals? I think that may be part of an answer to this very complex environment.
Thank you.
Is there any other question? You all people sitting so far away from each other.
You don't have to go to the gym anymore today.
Okay. Thank you very much, and also thank you for your work. The Leiden Manifest and all what you're doing is very inspiring. Actually, from on a university level, the situation is like this, that, you know, universities are doing a lot of things, like fostering transdisciplinary research, making open innovation in science, open up to public, and. Our problem is very strongly, it's more coming from the government level, because the government level always tells us, you know, in the international comparison, because we have to be better. If you look at the FTE strategy of Austria, it says even we have to be better in rankings. It's not about we have to be better in social impact or in the social relevance or so. And due to the fact that Leiden is not only the source of the manifesto, but also the source from one of the biggest rankings, the Leiden ranking, I wonder, is there any initiative in Leiden to make a new kind of ranking to compare international universities, so we can do more transdisciplinary things at universities? Because really the issue we really have, this is a certain force. Whatever we are doing here, whatever we are building up, all of a sudden there's coming something, okay, where are you in the rankings? And the press jumps on the train. Yeah. And unfortunately, you get what you measure.
Yes, yeah, that's a really huge debate as well. A lot of academic intervention here, indeed, from a number of angles. So what my colleagues did in our center was indeed to introduce a ranking that is based as much as possible on the principles that I just outlined. Although I also am slightly uncomfortable with the fact that we have one. But what it does is, it does intervene in a way in this space of university ranking, because it's only based on citation analysis. So it doesn't look at other things, it doesn't mingle methods, and it's not black boxed. But it's still a ranking. I think it's a better one. There's also something called U multi-rank. I don't know if you've heard of that. And what I think would be also helpful, and that's why we're also collaborating with DORA, and maybe you are familiar with the DORA declaration that was published in 2013. So that is also grown into this huge community with signatories that say, okay, we are not going to use the journal impact factor anymore. It became a community movement that also builds more responsible research evaluation practices. And we recently received funding to build a dashboard at the level of universities about responsible evaluation practices. So the purpose of that project that will run for the next couple of years is to do basically counter mapping against university rankings that focus only on one thing. And hopefully, so this afternoon we have a scoping event with representatives from across the globe to harvest information on what they would like to see in a dashboard like that. And we're looking at evaluation situations like hiring, promotion, and retention, for instance. So that's at the level of individual researchers. I can imagine that if we develop this further, universities can also be proud of other things. It will be a very slow process. Another intervention that is relatively, I wanted to say minor, but it's not. I mean, what we are doing is that we're asking our own university to make all the data available that they give to the rankings, the ranking institutions, about the performance of their staff, so that that is open for everyone to do analyses on. And that sounds like maybe a minor intervention, but that means that you will, if everyone starts to do that, you will take away the grounds for commercial rankers to produce bad rankings. And it will be a very big normative statement about openness in the kinds of data that are provided and used to describe research activities or other activities. So these are a couple of things that I can list now. This is a huge issue, it's a huge problem. Yeah.
Is there any other?
Just trying to keep you fit. Thanks, Sarah. You already actually touched on it. My point was always thinking about the different levels of where the indicators are being used, because I really see, and I think what you just mentioned with this kind of counter ranking on the university level makes a lot of sense. I just wanted to, I was very interested in the 9th principle, because it was exactly this about we have to know that indicators do have a life of their own. I remember many years ago, I'm involved in kind of educational indicators, and there used to be in the old ISKED system, which is for just, it's a classic indicator just to say what level education is. There used to be a difference between 5A and 5B. And 5B was kind of, the idea was it was more that technical education. And Finland always did very badly on, or had a high number of their students in 5B. But the main indicator, education at a glance at the OECD, was always using was 5A. And this led to Finland just reclassifying everything. So this is kind of the life of their own they have. Yeah. And so I was wondering, just again, maybe you could elaborate a bit more on this kind of different levels, because I totally understand. I work very closely now with the ministry in Germany. They have a different reason why they need numbers to the reason we need numbers. And we as individual academics have a different use also for the numbers as a university. So there's this kind of levels. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more on that element? Thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you for that. This is one of the crucial points, I think, in thinking about responsible research evaluation. And also when I think about that from the community of scientometricians, I was not myself trained as one, but I'm now heading an institute that houses a large quantitative science studies group. This is always the point they stress, right? So up until a couple of years ago, they always said we can do very good things at a national level and maybe at a meso level, but at an individual level it becomes really problematic. So that's one thing, that's about the technical and the methodological, but there's also these accountability relations that I think you're also referring to, that a ministry is accountable for dividing money, public spending, gives it also to funding agencies. There's that accountability relation. Funding agencies either have or have no room to choose what they spend that on. So there's also this relation. And in all these instances you see indicators and certain criteria emerge that at some point made sense, but maybe not make sense anymore. So that is, I think, 9 and 10 for these contexts as well. At the moment in the Netherlands, the ministry is revisiting their own quality control criteria, and also the ways in which they are receiving advice from academic communities. And there's, I think, a relationship between these things. So I think, hopefully, what they will do is put mechanisms in place to prevent nepotism and lobbying that is very prominent in some of these relations, and use criteria that are fit for the current situation, in which we are moving toward more open research, for instance, and in which we are talking about what are the responsibilities of universities and national science systems and higher education systems in addressing global challenges or regional challenges. So that has to come with a different set of indicators as well. So I think these two elements I can think of right now are very important. Hope that helps.
Thank you. I would like to come back to the first question, how to encourage academics to talk more to the public, and that this also counts in their academic career, because you started with this quote that, you know, speaking to politics and speaking to public doesn't actually count. And we have still this system that the classical publications in journals and so on is more or less the only measure for single academics. I come from social sciences and humanities, and here still the single authored piece is still, you know,
the Holy Grail.
So the question is, how can we come to a change that we acknowledge new channels of communication, and these are digital channels, these are social media, this is blogging. And so, for example, why can we train academics to be good academic bloggers, and that this counts for an academic career, for the CV? And I think this is still not the case, and the question is, where do you see also the game changers, or who can support this? And do you see already signs in this direction?
Yeah, I do think there is increasingly a window of opportunity to put this on the agenda of also administrations at the university levels, because this is starting to become a European level discussion, and there are national science systems that are now trying to develop alternative ways of doing this. One I'm familiar with, of course, is our own Dutch context. This is exactly an element of this new recognition and reward system. So it would require, I think, at the university level that so for us, it's one of the challenges is to step away from one-size-fits-all ways of looking at different faculties, for instance, but also asking of scientific directors of institutes, of deans of faculties, to step up and to start to talk about what is quality here, and that also, related to that, we do these types of activities when it comes to scholarly communication. We work together with these and these parties, and that means that this is what we call quality. But it sounds very maybe easy, but that conversation, at least in the Netherlands, we rarely have. And one of the issues, for instance, is in our system that there's rotating leadership. So I'm a scientific director now. In a couple of years, I will go back to the... So if I start messing around and shaking things up, I also will maybe create some backlash in the end. But I think it's not a local thing anymore. So there are resources to point to. And I can also maybe after this send you examples. I now get to talk a lot about this national level development. So that's one thing I think to make this a bit more of a European endeavor, so lift it from the local discussion and then back into the local discussion and ask leadership to step up. And there are a lot of ways to trace these types of activities, like blogging, or so the example I gave was on the project level, but there are a lot of ways to trace digitally also these types of activities, which maybe you know very well. Media studies scholars develop these types of methods as well. But there's work to be done to include that in the formal evaluation systems.